Welcome, everybody. We're going to start, and I will de-mask because I've got a sufficient distance, and actually we're getting to the end of the masks. Tomorrow is the last day of this on our campus, so it's an exciting time. Thank you for coming. We do need to thank a few people who made this special event possible, and I want to single out the UWL Political Science and Public Affairs Department. Many of the members are here. And Dr. Goodnow, Rachel, where are you? She in the room? Oh, she's doing so much hard work. Well, I hope she gets back, but we want to thank her. And then this was made possible by the very generous support and arrangements provided by the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership, and they came to us and said we can bring Ambassador Locke here, and we were just thrilled to do that. And so delighted to introduce the director of the Thompson Institute, a fantastic professor from UW-Madison, Alex Tack. So welcome.
Great, thank you, and thank you all for coming, and for everybody here, for Chancellor Gao and everybody in political science and all the staff who helped make this event possible, for partnering with us on it. I also want to thank the Thompson Center staff, Ruth Brash and Tia Westhoff here, who do the real hard work of making this event possible and letting me stand up here and introduce illustrious speakers. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me just say a few quick words. The Thompson Center was established in 2017 to follow in the footsteps of Governor Thompson, who worked proudly with colleagues from both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. Our primary goal is to determine how we can produce and facilitate effective public leadership. And with that aim in mind, we host events throughout the UW system. We fund research throughout the UW system. We offer scholarships throughout the UW system, and conduct other activities. And I should clarify for our Washingtonian guests today that by UW, I mean the proper use of those initials for University of Wisconsin, the best UW. We are also currently soliciting proposals for speaker and research grants. So if you have a research project, or also if you have a speaker in mind, like Ambassador Locke, who you think would be great to bring to campus, please submit a proposal. Honestly, these speaking engagements and events like this are some of the best parts of this job. I love going to campuses, meeting speakers like this, seeing events and taking parts in events like this. So please apply. Let me do more of these events. And come to these events. It's really, I think, some of the best things that we do. This year, we are particularly interested in applications dealing with state and local government relations, education and learning loss, as well as issues facing rural Wisconsin. But we are always interested in applications more generally relating to any aspect of public leadership. So if you're affiliated with UW-La Crosse or any UW school, please consider applying for those. I also want to mention briefly a few of our upcoming events. Tuesday of next week, we will have a virtual event with UW Parkside that we're calling What Would George Washington Do? That's on the March 15th at 5 p.m., where professor and historian Sandy Moats will interview 3 different prominent biographers of George Washington about leadership lessons from him and their relevance for us today. We will also have Sarah Binder and Mark Spindell at UW Oshkosh, but also live stream to talk about how Congress governs the Fed and their book on the myth of Fed independence. If you study American politics, you've likely encountered Sarah Binder and her work before, and I think we're going to be delighted to have them. And third, I want to particularly plug another event we will have in person here at UW-La Crosse on April 5th, when we will host Paul Tucker. Paul is the former deputy governor of the Bank of England, the central bank in the United Kingdom, who will be here to talk about central bank leadership and his views on the role of central bankers and other technocrats in a democratic society. He's written a book on this subject, which is excellent, called Unelected Power, and it's going to be a delight to have him here. He's just a fascinating guy. So please, if you're free on April 5th, I think that will be a terrific in-person event as well as live-streamed event. For more information on our upcoming events, we do about 36 events throughout the year, so lots of events. If they're not at UW-La Crosse, they're almost all live-streamed. So you can find more about that, as well as our grant and speaker and research grant opportunities and other aspects of the center at our website, thompsoncenter.wisc.edu. So I mentioned Governor Thompson's legacy a minute ago. Although our guest today hails from the other side of the political aisle, I think he shares a lot in common with Governor Thompson, both in the positions he's held. They've both been state legislators, governors, and cabinet secretaries, as well as his qualities as a public leader. Gary Locke was born and raised in Seattle. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in political science from Yale and law degree from Boston University, he worked for several years as a deputy prosecutor in King County, Washington, the county that contains Seattle. He was elected to the Washington House of Representatives in 1982, where he served until he was elected King County Executive in 1993. And then in 1996, he was elected governor of the state of Washington, and where he was reelected in 2000, winning by double-digit margins, much as Governor Thompson did here. In 2009, he was nominated by President Obama to be Secretary of Commerce, and that's despite his having served as the Washington co-chair of Senator Clinton's campaign during the Democratic primary the previous year. He was confirmed by the Senate by voice vote. As Secretary, Locke led the Obama administration's National Export Initiative to double American exports, oversaw the 2010 census, which came in $2 billion under budget, and reduced the patent application time, wait time from 40 weeks down to 40 months, down to 24 months. Following this, in 2011, he was nominated to be U.S. Ambassador to China, where he was again confirmed by voice vote. He served in that role until 2014. As ambassador, Locke earned a popular reputation for his frugal, low-key style, particularly after a Chinese businessman had snapped a photo of Locke carrying his own backpack and ordering his own coffee at the airport in Seattle soon after his appointment. That photo went viral in China. As ambassador, Locke worked to improve market access for U.S. goods and services, reduced wait times for visa interviews for Chinese applicants from 100 days down to 3 days, and help expose the severity of the air pollution in China. During Locke's tenure, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing also took in dissident civil rights activist Chen Guangcheng, who had escaped house arrest. Since the end of his time as ambassador, Locke has most recently served as president of Bellevue College, the largest school in the Washington Community and Technical Colleges system, and the third largest institute of higher education in the state of Washington. When we began planning this event, I had in mind leadership challenges we face amid rising tensions in U.S. relations with China, something in which Governor Locke is obviously highly qualified to comment on, as well as more general leadership questions that he can obviously speak to. Some commentators have suggested that increasing economic and military competition from China is the beginning of a new Cold War. Others have suggested that high levels of trade and integration with China in today's global economy means a more cooperative dynamic exists, and many views exist, as some combination of these or different from these. The current conflict in Ukraine, though, has added new complexities to U.S. foreign relations. As Western nations implement unprecedented sanctions against Russia and provide support to Ukraine while avoiding a direct role in the conflict. There's been renewed discussion and debate over the approach that the U.S. should take in relations with Russia. One can see China here as a crucial player to be wooed in making sanctions against Russia effective, or one can see Russia as a crucial player to be wooed in a new Cold War against China, or one can see Russia and China as allies whose authoritarian regimes make them implacably opposed to liberal democracies throughout the world, or many other possible views. We can also see parallels here with some important differences between Russia's government, the Russian government's view of Ukraine and the Chinese government's view of Taiwan. The status of Taiwan and questions of Taiwanese independence or integration with the PRC provide a key point of tension with the PRC. And the current conflict in Ukraine may hold insights into how and whether a military conflict over Taiwan status can be avoided, as well as providing insights to the Chinese regime into the costs and benefits of an invasion. I hope we will have an opportunity to explore these and many other questions with Ambassador Locke today. Today's event will be a fireside chat with between Ambassador Locke and Chancellor Gao here. Joe Gao probably needs no introduction here, but let me very briefly introduce him again. Joe Gao received his bachelor's degree in journalism from Penn State, his MA in speech communication from the University of Alabama, and his PhD in speech communication, again from Penn State. He previously was the director in communication studies of the Communication Studies program at Alfred State University in my original home of upstate New York, as well as Dean of the Colleges of Liberal Arts at Winona State University and Provost Interim President of the Nebraska Wesleyan University. In 2007, Gao, of course, became Chancellor here at UW-La Crosse and has served in that role since. So thank you very much, Chancellor Gao, for doing this, and I look forward to the discussion.
A warm UWL welcome to Ambassador Gary Locke. Yeah. Wow. We haven't even started yet. Now, there is so much to talk about. And when we arranged this visit, the ambassador wanted to be sure that all of you have the opportunity to ask lots of questions. And we had a dinner last night with faculty and students. And boy, you fully engaged them. So we'll leave plenty of time for that. There are microphones in the back. And hopefully have a nice dialogue. I think, of course, the topic of the moment is the Ukraine, and someone that has your extensive experience with diplomacy and international policy, how would you explain to somebody like me that doesn't have that insight what's happening in Ukraine right now?
Well, first of all, let me just thank the Tommy Thompson Center and Alex for the invitation to come to University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, the other UW. And it's really a pleasure. And the staff and faculty and the students have really been so warm and gracious and welcoming from last night into some of the sessions that we had this morning. So I really enjoyed this so far and looking forward to our conversation here and hope we can have lots of questions from the audience. But let me just say that the situation in Ukraine is obviously very complicated, and the reality is that Ukraine is a separate country, used to be part of the Soviet Union, but is a separate country, recognized by even China and the international community as a separate country. It's been observed that Putin and Russia has, various objectives. He wants to somehow reestablish the old Soviet Union. And bristles at the fact that many of the former members of the Soviet Union are trying to be part of the EU or even want to join NATO. He's very upset at some of the movement of NATO forces closer to the border. But obviously, it's just a deplorable situation with the casualties among civilians and the indiscriminate bombing of civilian facilities, including hospitals and so forth, and so many millions of Ukrainians trying to move, get out of Ukraine and get across the border. The West has imposed some very tough sanctions against Russia, cutting them off from basic financial services, the financial markets, and it's really going to cripple and impact the Russian economy and therefore daily interactions for the Russian people. And goods will not be able to flow in and out. A lot of companies and people won't have access to their funds, and so it will have a very devastating and severe impact on the everyday people of Russia. Will it be enough? Is a good question. And how far is the West willing to go by way of sanctions and countermeasures to Russia? Because quite frankly, some of the trade that's been exempted from these sanctions is the trade of energy. 40%, I think, of oil comes from Russia, that Europe uses, comes from Russia, and not as much of natural gas, or maybe it's the other way around. I always get them confused. But the reality is that Europe depends so much on natural gas and oil from Russia. So how far are the Europeans willing to go to punish Russia, to retaliate against Russia, knowing that it's going to really hurt them as well? And so this gets into that whole issue of human rights and your values and how far you're willing to stand up for your values and the pain and the consequences you might bear and willing to bear when you uphold these various principles. When you say we cannot tolerate what China is doing or Russia is doing, but to what extent? The United States right now, we're seeing a huge increase in the price of gasoline, and will people say, well, it's too much, therefore we need to relax our sanctions against Russia because we don't want to pay more at the pump. Now, the reality is that the United States is actually exporting our oil. We are a big producer of oil. So then why is the price of gasoline going up? Because there's not going to be enough oil around the rest of the world if we're limiting what comes out of Russia. So therefore, oil and natural gas is a more precious commodity worldwide. And if you happen to hold something that's now more valuable around the world, you can charge more for it. You know, it becomes more valuable. So the price at the pump goes up, not because we're short of oil in the United States, not because we get oil from Russia, but because what we hold now is so much more valuable for people around the world. But then the question is, are the American people willing to stomach that? As we say, we need to stand up against Russia.
Interesting, because this conflict, we have, and I don't know that it's ever been this way before, we have very highly developed social media so that the imagery coming out of Ukraine, you see the human toll that it takes. And I wonder how that will impact other countries, whereas in ancient days, that was all isolated and you didn't see, well, what's really happening. I mean, we have a alum of UWL who is in Kyiv at the embassy, and he was an international student here and returned home. Mm-hmm. And he's in daily contact with people here, and it just gives it an immediacy that I don't know that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, obviously with the advent of social media and cable television and everything, we're able to get now instant images, instant analysis, instant news of what's happening, compared to even, you know, when many of us older folks were activists in the 60s and the 70s and, you know, of protesting the war in Vietnam. You know, the images took many days to get here, and news coverage was rather spotty. And obviously, our grandparents and parents who lived during World War II, I mean, those images came weeks later. But now everything is instant. But also, social media is able to control the narrative, and people subscribe to different viewpoints using social media. There's a report that even the Russian perspective of the war in Ukraine is now gaining greater hold in the United States, certainly in other countries. Obviously, in Russia, it's a totally different. They feel like they're liberating the people of parts of Ukraine, and they're really going after. They're seeing the president of Ukraine as akin to being Hitler, and so they feel very righteous in terms of what they're doing, liberating the people of Ukraine against a Hitler-type a regime. In China, the narrative is very much pro-Russia and blaming the West and specifically the United States for the turmoil, saying it was the actions of the United States, the military actions, the actions of NATO at the direction of the United States in moving forces that threatened Russia. And so and of course the social media there is controlled very much by the government, and the government of China is closely aligned with Russia.
It would seem that the images, the information, are essential in terms of public opinion about a situation like that. When you were ambassador to China, obviously you had access to information that none of us are ever going to have. But what do you see as the most credible sources for those of us who want to follow world events?
Well, I think the major newspapers are very, very good at providing more in-depth analysis and coverage. And unfortunately, newspapers, especially local newspapers, have gotten so thin and become so meager, and really oftentimes present really capsulized, almost very sparse summary of what's really happening. I mean, I look at our local newspapers in Seattle and even here in La Crosse, they're just a few pages, and many of the stories are just really brief excerpts of stories and articles from the major newspapers. So I try to read the big newspapers and the in-depth coverage. And I'm on my phone and I get headline news, but the headline news are just headlines. And you really cannot get a full explanation and analysis of all the intricacies and the nuances of what's happening. So in-depth reporting is, I think, essential. And I think that really speaks to bringing back local newspapers and having robust publications and a variety of different sources, so that whether it's the Wall Street Journal with its particular a view of things, to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and others, or the Economist. And I think it's really important for us in this modern society, modern day, to look to as many sources as possible, to understand the competing views and interpretations, and so that we can form our own opinions.
And it seems like it's a rather cliche, but you get the news that you pay for. I mean, I'm struck by how what's out there for free is probably not that thorough. And it seems like they boil this down to, well, Putin's a strong man and it's his ego, and it's got to be more complicated than that.
Yeah, no, all these issues are very, very complicated. And I remember when I was in college, I'd read the New York Times, and it would have a 4-page article talking about how, for instance, the Israelis armed forces rescued hostages in a particular country, and just that hour-by-hour account I found utterly fascinating, and I think so I very much like these long articles that might be 2 or 3 pages long in a newspaper, talking about even the plight of people in rural Oregon and the social the social challenges and the health challenges that they're facing. Just really bringing it down to earth and really in terms of real life, everyday people.
I was listening to NPR the other day, which is a pretty good source, I think. And I guess the issue right now in Ukraine is, does the United States impose a no-fly zone or support that? And then there are the MiGs in Poland that we have so far said we don't support giving those to Ukraine. Do you think that will change? I mean, it seems like our leadership is being very cautious on this situation.
Well, it's a really super complicated issue, and I don't profess to have all the answers or have all the insights, but if we really believe that this invasion is absolutely contrary to all international law, how far are we willing to go to stand up for our principles and to defend the people of Ukraine and the government of Ukraine? I mean, if we go around saying that we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, is that a signal for Putin to basically say, oh, I have free reign? And at what point after the atrocities occur in Ukraine does the United States or do the European allies then step in? And is it too late at that point? So these are all big issues that I don't profess to have an answer to, but it's just the concept of, you know, if we view Putin as almost akin to a Hitler and destroying a community and a country, to what lengths will we go to stand up? And what are the limits? And then, like I said, the EU is confronted with this notion that, yeah, they want to impose sanctions, but they also get, you know, the bulk of the vast majority of their energy supply from Russia. And so, okay, what's the balance? Are we going to sacrifice our human rights concerns and our principles in favor of having gasoline and oil to heat our homes and run our factories, et cetera, et cetera? So
now, when you were ambassador to China, I'm sure you communicated to Chinese leadership our country's concerns about some of the things that they do. What kind of response do you get as ambassador?
Well, you know, they're very polite and say, well, thank you very much, but we disagree. You know, this is our country, this is our history, these are our values, this is our political system, and you know, and they'll say that we're not doing whatever you allege, but nonetheless they'll say, you know, we are dealing with it in an appropriate manner. And the reality is that we are another country, very different from China, just as Germany and France are very different from the United States, and I'm sure that the diplomats of those countries and the leaders of those countries may have, you know, specific thoughts on, for instance, how America should approach climate change or reduction of greenhouse gases, how we should approach the income inequality. They may have ideas about regulation of businesses and even our, you know, Buy America policies. All right. And so they may come to the leaders in the Congress and to the administration, Democratic or Republican, and they'll say, this is what we think you should be doing. And the typical response, quite frankly, of Americans, political leaders is, thank you very much. We appreciate your views, but we are America. So this is our country. Don't tell us what to do. All right. Well, we express our views to other countries, whether it's countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, or China, and they'll say, thank you very much. You know, we have our glorious history of thousands of years, and this is our culture, these are our values, and this is our religious system and political system. Thank you very much, but this is our country, and we'll do what we want to do. So, but you know, but there is, diplomacy is very valuable in trying to keep lines of communication open, to really try to solve problems together in a collaborative fashion, to try to avoid problems and crises from occurring, to really state the positions of governments, especially in tense situations, so that other countries know exactly what the United States is going to do or will do. And that we have deep concerns about, let's say, your trade policies and your practices, your treatment of Americans, and that we have certain things that we will do in response if the American government does not see, you know, some change in behavior. But for us to believe, for any country to believe that it can impose its will or dramatically change the culture, the mores of another country, whether it's on human rights, whether it's on economic policy or you know, social services, et cetera, I think is unrealistic. And I think most diplomats understand that there are limits to the power of diplomacy and to foreign policy.
And then when you were Commerce Secretary, I imagine you had a lot of conversations with people in China on trade. How did that change when you became ambassador and it's a little bit different focus?
Actually, really, it didn't really change because the U.S. position has been very clear. I mean, we want more access for American companies to do business in China, to be treated equally and fairly. The United States is open to all kinds of companies from around the world to do business in the United States. We have very few restrictions other than for national security. But, you know, foreign banks can come here as long as they operate under the same rules as American banks. People can be involved in oil and gas, et cetera, as long as they follow all of the environmental and regulatory rules and so forth. In China, many of those markets are off limits. The American banking, financial institutions, insurance is severely limited in their ability to do business and even offer good products that are not even available in China. And so we think that the introduction of American businesses and going into China can actually help the Chinese people with insurance and financial services, products that they don't have access to by the Chinese institutions, as well as creating jobs for American companies and American workers. So we think that those are the win-win opportunities. The oil and gas industry, energy sector is completely closed off to foreign participation. And yet we are very open here. So we're always advocating on behalf of more open markets, protection of intellectual property, fair, independent judiciary and enforcement of the laws, et cetera, et cetera. And so from Commerce Secretary to Ambassador, we're still pursuing it, the same things, but using different mechanisms and different approaches. But the policy was still the same.
You know, you mentioned international or intellectual property. I guess in China, our social media like Facebook and Instagram and so on, they are either regulated or blocked?
No, they're not allowed. I mean, there is,
allowed.
you know, for instance, Google is not available. Facebook, Instagram, can't remember some of these, but there are so many things that we take for granted here by way of social media that is not even permitted in China. Even CNN regularly is blacked out and the screen goes dark for maybe 4 or 5 minutes when they cover a topic, whether it's Taiwan, Tibet, the Uyghurs, or other international issues that deal with China. So it suddenly just goes blank.
Does the embassy get to?
Well, we're able to get we have our own feeds, and so we're able to see what's on the newscast and things like that. But the everyday person, you know, in your hotel room, a visitor in a hotel room, a person, a resident living in whether American or foreign or Chinese, will not have access to some of this stuff.
What was? I mean, I think we all have an image of an ambassador or diplomacy. What's the day-to-day life like of the ambassador to China? I mean, that is.
Well, each country is unique and very different, but the U.S. Embassy in Beijing is, I think, the largest U.S. embassy in the world outside of the embassy in Baghdad, Iraq. And they, of course, have a lot of security and military personnel associated with that embassy, but I think we're the largest. And we have about 1,000 employees throughout all of our different buildings. But interestingly enough, and this is true for all countries, U.S. embassies around the world, only about 1/3 are American personnel, and about 2/3 are local, doing the administrative work and things like that, non-sensitive, non-classified information. But we rely on local people to help run to keep the trains going and maintain the buildings and so forth. But the role of an ambassador is really presiding over all the different federal agencies there. We have people from not just the State Department, but Commerce Department, Energy Department, FBI, Drug Enforcement, IRS, Health and Human Services, Energy Department, Department of Agriculture, Trade Representative Office, to I think, well, obviously the military, the CIA, and things like that. And so the ambassador is in some ways the administrator for all the different agencies there, making sure that they're all coordinated, working together, working efficiently, not in silos. I mean, if the Energy Department and the Commerce Department want to promote trade and bring American companies to possibly sell their products and services in China, and let's say they're focusing on clean energy, well, we should make sure that the Commerce Department and the Energy Department collaborate and do it together, instead of one group having their own conference and trade mission and another one having their own. We're much more effective when we bring everybody together to work on it. Same thing with the law enforcement side, whether it's the FBI, IRS, drug enforcement, and things like that. Why not work together on some common issues and bring everybody together and be more efficient and more effective and have more impact when you have 10 people working on it, as opposed to 2 people on this, 2 people on this, and 2 people from another agency. So trying to get the agencies to really work together was always a challenge. And then, of course, our main function is reporting back to Washington, D.C., sending information of what we're learning, what we're hearing, analysis of what's going on in the country. Another part is taking care of Americans that are in the country. Whether it's the embassy or the ambassador in Brazil or India, China or Russia or whatever. If you have American visitors, American students, people working at Microsoft or FedEx, and something happens to them and they need help, they get arrested. We need to protect them, make sure their rights are being observed, and that we're able to check on their welfare, advocate on behalf of fair legal treatment. Again, our powers are limited, because if someone violates the law of a country, they're subject to the laws of that country. And we may think that the treatment and the prison sentence may be harsh, but certain countries, like if someone is found with some drugs, sometimes it's the death penalty in various countries. That's the law for everybody in that country. And just because you're an American doesn't mean you're above the law of India or Singapore or Malaysia. And you have to follow the rules, just as a French person, a German person is subject to the laws of America, even though what they're doing in America may not be criminal in their country, right? So, we have to make sure that they're being treated fairly and humanely, and have access to lawyers and so forth. So we're always, and then what happens if you're a tourist and and let's say a part of a tour, and a member of the tour suddenly dies in China? We need to help the family and the members get the body back to the United States, and that's very, very complicated. So we're always, number one duty is to protect the interests of American citizens that might be in that country, looking out for their welfare, advocating on behalf of U.S. interests, whether it's political, diplomatic, or business interests, and then also trying to share the values of America with the people of that country. So that means promoting, giving talks and lectures at colleges, universities, whether it's by our personnel, or encouraging those types of symposium by Americans who are living and working in that country, like China or Beijing, to speeches by the ambassador, promoting and showcasing partnerships, especially joint medical research and work that we're doing in hospitals and things like that. All of that is important to really inform the world of what we stand for as Americans, our values, our generosity, our respect for other cultures. And I think that, and then we also try to encourage visitors to the United States through our visas and our embassy. If you're a resident and you want, if you live in another country and you want to come to the United States, for most people in most countries around the world, you have to get a visa, and in order to get a visa, you have to have an in-person interview. And maybe it's 10 minutes, and sometimes you have to travel 2,000 miles to the nearest consulate or embassy to get that 10-minute interview to come to the United States as a business person, because you want to come to La Crosse, maybe to look at a product made here in La Crosse and you as a Chinese business person might want to order that made in USA product, and you need a visa to come to the United States to check out that product here. And you got to have that 10-minute interview first. And now if you're a person, let's say in Germany or France or Japan, one of our close allies, you don't need to have a visa interview. You just show up, hop on a plane, show your passport, and show your passport when you come to the United States and land in the United States. But if you're from Brazil, if you're from India, you're from China, you're from Pakistan, most countries in Africa and many countries in Eastern Europe, you have to have that visa interview before you can come to the United States. And no guarantee you get the visa. So that's a big part of our operation, interviewing people who are requesting a visa to come to the United States. And that's true for every embassy and consulate all across the world, a U.S. embassy and consulate across the world. So yeah, it's sharing American values, and that's what we call soft diplomacy. And so we tell all of our personnel, you're all ambassadors, because as Americans, people are watching, and they make their opinions, form their opinions on how Americans act. And every tourist, American tourist, is an ambassador because you're projecting the image of America to the rest of the world.
So the mission there seems very focused, and you have a defined number of people. That must be quite a different leadership context than, say, the Commerce Department, big federal organization, or governor of the state of Washington with a state government. How would you compare and contrast those different experiences that you've had leading in those contexts?
Well, I've always looked for management challenges, and I always like trying to shake up bureaucracies and try to make them more efficient and more effective, always from the user perspective, the customer perspective. So, I mean, in the embassy, we want to project that Americans are welcoming people in a country, and that we want people to come to the United States as tourists, or to buy American products, or to study in America. And so we say we want people to realize that the American embassy is a great place and a welcoming place. So one of my first tasks was to reduce the wait times to get an appointment for that visa interview. When I was there, it was taking up to 100 days for you to schedule your visa interview. And I said, guys, that's costing us American jobs. Because if you have to wait 100 days for your visa interview as a family, you want to come to the United States to visit the Grand Canyon, and you're told you got to wait 100 days, and not every member of the family not every member will get a visa, possibly. And if two of your children are denied a visa, are you going to go on that vacation to Grand Canyon? Or if you're told that you got to wait 100 days for your visa interview with no guarantee you get the visa to come to La Crosse to visit that factory to possibly buy that American product, they're going to say, forget it. And that means loss of jobs for the American people, because those tourists, they shop in malls, eat in restaurants, stay in the hotels, and buy souvenirs and whatever. That's money for American companies, which means jobs for American people, right? And so I said, we got to really streamline this. And people fought me and said, no, we can't do anything. We can't do anything. Well, within a month and a half, we got it down to 5 days. And 2 months later, we got it down to 3 days. So, I mean, that's the type of management challenges I like in terms of and it made the people in the embassy proud. Our employees were so proud of our transformation, because then it became headline news all over China that, wow, this is great. Look what the embassy did. And then became a model for embassies across the world in terms of American embassies and consulates. Commerce Department, yeah, different bureaucracy. So many of the employees, virtually all the employees in the federal government are career federal employees. And the word is that it doesn't matter whether you're working for a Republican or a Democratic administration. Hey, you guys are political people. You come and go. We've been here and we'll be here long after you're gone. So, we don't have to listen to you. And so my job at the Commerce Department, along with trying to help the president jumpstart or restart the economy, because President Obama came in the time of the Great Recession when unemployment just skyrocketed and people were losing jobs and losing health care benefits and things like that. So the job was to try to get the American people back to work and so they could support their families. And I looked at some of our processes and I said, we're actually hindering that objective. I mean, for instance, we give out grants of about $500 million a year for economic development projects. And it might be $5 million for a small town to double the size of their water treatment facility because an existing company wants to grow in size or a new company wants to come in town, but the water supply is inadequate in terms of the capability of treatment. And so they would apply for maybe a $5 or $10 million grant. And sometimes a community would apply for a $15 million grant to fix up a port so they could bring in more ships and export and do trade and things like that. Or a business incubator, a public-private partnership on business incubators to help startups get formed. On average, it was 20 months for a decision to be made by the Commerce Department. And I think about 70%, 60% of those were yeses, but 20 months. I said, whoa, the faster we can get that money out, the faster the construction, the remodeling of that water treatment facility. And then as soon as that's done, then the new company comes in or grows in size, and that means more people that are being hired. And I said, we got to change this, guys. And we were able to get it down to 18 days. From 20 months down to 18 days. We changed our processes. Didn't hire more people. We just completely reinvented things. And so those are the type of management challenges I like, because I think we need to instill greater confidence and respect for government. I mean, in times of a hurricane or a natural disaster or a tornado or a flood, people turn to government for assistance. And government has a very positive impact on people's lives. And maybe I was driven by and inspired by John F. Kennedy, who I guess gave a speech here many years ago. But his inaugural speech, ask not what you can do for your country, but what you can do for your country. And so that whole notion of public service has always been deep in me. And so I'm always trying to improve people's respect for government by showing that government can be more efficient, more effective, and more responsive. And I really think that all organizations, even nonprofit and business organizations, need to focus on some of the key interactions with their customers, the users of their services. What would mean most to the people who use your service? So, I mean, like whether it's reducing the patents processing down from, at that time it was like 48 months. The industry thinks that patents should be issued within about 20 months because they want to start developing and manufacturing prior to the patent being issued so they get a head start. So they don't want their discovery made really public too quickly. So they want a head start. But 40 months, it makes it hard to get investment and to even know that you're able to have protection for your invention. So, we were able to get it down and actually say, we'll guarantee you a patent if you really want it, or we'll guarantee you a decision within 12 months if you really, really want it. So we're just always saying, what can we do to respond to the needs of people, everyday people, the people who use your services? Because I want government employees to be proud to call themselves a government employee, and I want their friends and neighbors to ooh and ah if you say, hey, I work for the state of Washington, I work for the Commerce Department or whatever. The same way they might ooh and ah if the employee said that they worked at Microsoft or Apple or some major organization.
So for the past about a year and a half, you've been serving as interim president of Bellevue College, which is the 32,000 student enrollments there in the Seattle area. How has that experience been compared to all that you just talked about? And I guess I have a little bias here because I'm in that role, but are you able to get change happening in a college and university environment?
It is a totally different environment. A totally different environment, and there's a totally different culture there. of collaboration, collegiality, and consensus. And I think in some ways it is very, very slow to change. Very, very slow to change. And I think that higher education is facing a huge challenge right now in terms of what is the value of a degree, and what type of degrees do we offer? Does it need to be a 4-year degree or even a 2-year degree? Should it be more certificates and really targeted surgical intensive training, whether by badges or certificates? The role of the internet. I watch cable television shows and news oftentimes as a background, and I'm seeing all these advertisements for online education by certain institutions, and they guarantee that tuition will be constant for so many years and you can get a degree easily. So what is the value? So what is the role of institutions like University of Wisconsin, La Crosse, or Madison in terms of the 4-year degree? What is the value add that our traditional institutions provide compared to some of these online institutions, whether it's Southern New Hampshire University, Phoenix University, Western Governors University, and so forth. And yet we also know that education is lifelong. We need to instill this ethic of lifelong learning. So yes, maybe I do want to take a French class when I'm 50 years old, or I want to learn, I was so nervous and so afraid to take this course when I was in college. I want to go back and take it now, whether it's literature or history or something. So online is a great vehicle to take a course and continue your education, especially if you live in a remote area, all right? Or you're working and you have family obligations and you got kids. So maybe Saturday morning or Friday night at 1 o'clock in the morning is an ideal time for me to be taking a course offered asynchronously. But how do we ensure that for most of higher education we offer that personal interaction, that opportunity to interact with faculty and other students, and that collaborative spirit? The technology of Zoom and Teams is very limited because you can't have all these voices kind of talking at the same time, and then you can pick out one voice and say, oh, let's follow up on that. It's when someone talks, the other person is blocked out. And so how do you have that robust discussion? So I think there's huge challenges for higher education, and we need to be moving more nimbly. We need to be responding very, very quickly, especially if, in our state, and we're seeing this at community technical colleges all across the state and across the country, and as part of it is the counter-cyclical nature of education, especially at the 2-year schools. When the economy is booming and people, jobs are going unfilled, employers aren't looking at degrees, especially 2-year degrees or technical degrees, maybe not even BA degrees. And so enrollments have been going down for the last several years. And this is happening all across the country as well. So how do we, and so my community college, we also offer 4-year degrees, and that's one of the bright spots of our college. Our 4-year degree programs are exploding. And we also have high school students. We're getting both high school credit and college credit at the same time, so they can graduate from high school and already have 2 years of college credit, so they can then transfer to the University of Washington or another 4-year school as a junior. And that participation in all of our community colleges as a high school student is free. So you're getting 2 years of college education for free, and getting a head start on your 4-year degree. But we have so many community colleges in the Puget Sound, Seattle area. And I keep telling our faculty, with enrollments going down, why should they come to our college? They can take that online course from the college across the river or across the lake. They don't have to come to us. So what are we offering that makes us unique from the other community technical colleges if people are off looking for a 2-year degree and not able to take that 4-year degree that we have, but they're just taking the regular 2-year transfer degree? Why from us? Why not from Phoenix University or whatever that's being offered online? What do we add? What value do we add? And so I think we have to be responsive and nimble. And for the people that are working and having families, when would they like the opportunity to interact with faculty? When do we offer advising? It can't be just 9 to 5. Maybe our advising and counseling should be available on a Saturday morning, right? I mean, I fly mostly Alaska Airlines, and I don't like going online to book it because sometimes I have a little quirky thing and I have all these questions I want to ask. So I call up at 12:30 in the morning. I'm a late night person. I call at 12:30 in the morning, call the 1-800 number, and I get the customer service. And I always ask them, so where did I reach you? The customer service agents on Alaska Airlines are either in Seattle, Boise, Idaho, or I think Salem, Oregon. And they're working from their home. They're working from their home. Maybe our college counselors and support staff can also work at home at hours convenient to our students. So.
Although I can't help but observe what we're doing here right now is really the essence of what we do at this university. We could have done this virtually, but there's something about us being in a room with an outstanding visitor that is very special. And on that note, I know you have questions for Ambassador Locke. So there are mics back there, and don't be shy, please. This is a really great opportunity, and I can go on and on. But I know you want to hear from.
I think the technology has shown us that we can do a lot of things remotely, but also the technology in this pandemic has shown us how much we crave for that human interaction and that spontaneity of being able to interact with other students in a classroom setting. You can have a free flow of discussion, and everybody can be talking at the same time, and you're able to pick out some of these different conversations, and you can then hone in on something. You can't do that with Zoom or Teams. You can't hear 5 people talking, and you just don't get that warmth and interaction and spontaneity. So
I think I see Andrew Erickson right there.
Yes. Is this one working? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Ketchikow, you may not be surprised. This is going to be about the environment. So, so there's been a lot of talk recently about energy independence, and I think we're kind of constrained on what we can do because Europe is so reliant on Russian oil and gas. And I think you talked about this. So I guess I'm curious, what impact might energy independence and the current Russian-Ukraine conflict have on the switch to clean energy?
I'm sorry, what was that last part? What
effect do you think it might have on the switch to clean energy? Speed it up, slow it down?
Oh, I think clearly it will speed up countries trying to be more independent and find other sources of energy. Even now, there are reports that the administration in D.C. is approaching Saudi Arabia, even Iran and Venezuela to produce more oil. Countries that we have not necessarily had good, warm relations with for various issues, from human rights to political differences. And and I think Europe understands that very much. We are already pretty much energy independent, America. We produce more, actually. We are now a major exporter of liquid natural gas and oil. As much as we want to start moving away from fossil fuels, nonetheless, we are exporting. And I think this is going to accelerate that notion of energy independence, and certainly diversification of your supply. Just as we've seen from the pandemic in terms of personal protective gear, how so much of it was coming from China, or even chips and everything else, low-cost chips coming from various countries. We need to diversify our supplies so that whether it's on health crises and pandemics to technological goods to energy, no country should be overly reliant on other areas or regions of the world.
Thanks. And then a follow-up, this is kind of asking about some of your experience as the governor of Washington. I know that Washington produces a lot of hydroelectricity, and it's kind of a hot topic because it does produce clean energy, but it also has some significant effects on the environment.
Yep.
Do you think that hydroelectricity has its place in this transition to diversify energy resources?
Well, obviously, we're relying more on our hydroelectric facilities, dams, to produce electricity while we move away from coal-powered plants. There's even a push now for more nuclear plants, even though we have been shutting down many of our nuclear plants over the last several decades. Hydroelectric power has huge impact on fish. And we're suffering from a decline in salmon runs. And there's a lot of talk about trying to get rid of some of the power producing dams along the Columbia River that are really impeding the passage of fish. There are other parts of the Pacific Northwest where there really are no fish, high up in the mountains. And so some of those hydroelectric facilities are not a threat to fish runs. And I think that's our biggest concern. There are obviously environmental trade-offs on any type of energy production, whether it's nuclear, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the impact on birds, for instance, and so forth. So those are all trade-offs, but I think we do have to move away from fossil fuels. How we do that is going to be tough. But let me be a little bit controversial right here, though. I think we need to be very careful when we say, in terms of climate justice. We talk about how oftentimes energy-producing plants and the location of energy-producing plants have health impacts on marginalized communities and low-income communities. And there are many people in the United States that say we should not be exporting types of fossil fuels to, let's say, other countries of the world because it's helping them become dependent on fossil fuels. But are we going to say that some of the most underdeveloped countries of the world should remain poor because we don't want them to use natural gas to produce electricity that they would need to even have electricity in their villages? We want you to stay poor because you're contributing to greenhouse gases. Because if you use natural gas or oil to produce electricity. In China, there are millions and millions of people who are dying prematurely because of the use of coal and the coal dust. And that's documented by both Chinese medical researchers and American researchers. More use of natural gas would severely clean up the environment of China, but it is a fossil fuel. In my village, where my dad's family still lives, it is a village about 1.5 miles, 2 miles from a major city of millions of people. They have maybe one light bulb hanging from each room. Up until recently, there was no running water in the homes. They had wells and pumps in each of the homes. Their toilets are a big outhouse about 100 yards at the edge of, away in the edge of the village. And they cook using wood kindling and coal briquettes in the back. They don't have microwaves. The refrigerator is about the size of what you see in a hotel room or a college dorm. Because there's not enough electricity in China for the people. And that's how 40% of the people live in China. And then, of course, you go into Tibet and people, they're very nomadic life and they don't have electricity. And they cook using wood and coal and everything else. So as countries try to modernize, where are they going to find that electricity? How are they power those electrical plants? And are we to say that because China, you are the number one, the world's largest producer of greenhouse gases, and you need to curb your greenhouse gases? America, of course, produces more per person than any other country in the world, but China produces more because it's got 4 times the population. So, but are we to say in Tibet are we to say in rural China, family village, no more power plants, because the fastest way you can produce power is through fossil fuels. We want you to stay poor. While we as Americans have, these huge machines and appliances that produce so much, that consume so much electricity. We talk about climate justice, but what about international climate justice? The people in Africa, how are they supposed to get their electricity to have even just the basic necessities that we all take for granted? So, sorry for that little tirade or
no. And
editorial.
If you go online, there are some wonderful pictures of you returning to your family's home, and boy, those people were excited to see you. It's quite an interesting photo.
Yeah.
I saw some folks go back. Yeah.
Just curious, back to the Ukraine and Putin. Does international opinion have any impact at all on a leader like Putin, do you think? Or does he operate totally independently of what's going on in the rest of the world?
Autocratic leaders could care less about public opinion and world opinion, because if they did, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. Right? With the world condemnation, the moral indignation of the rest of the world, UN resolutions, they could care less about that. But whether you're a mayor or you're a governor, member of Congress, or the president, you care about how the people, your constituents, feel about you. Because if the constituents turn against you, you're out of power. You're out of office, whether as a mayor, a city council member, or a school board member, right? And so certainly the economic sanctions on Russia will have some impact on the everyday people, and maybe the power brokers and the oligarchs and the people that are keeping him in power. And maybe that will impact him.
What do you, I know it's impossible to just conjecture, but what is his end game, do you think?
I'm sorry?
What is his end game?
I think he would like, I'm just a casual observer, and so I'm not privy to any of the discussions in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, but from what I understand, he would like to somehow restore part of the glory of the USSR and chase at the breakup of the USSR. And certainly Ukraine was one of the key republics within the USSR.
And if that's true, is there anything that anybody can do except for military power?
It depends on whether the people will turn against him and whether the casualties among the Russian forces and even the Ukrainian people will affect the attitudes of the Russian people and the other political leaders and economic leaders of Russia.
Do you think NATO has any power to check Putin or not?
Well, they're trying to. They're trying to figure out how to maybe get them supply more weapons and anti-tank missiles and other sophisticated arms to Russia. To Ukraine, and talking about trying to bring some jets in from other countries in and backstopping those air forces with American jets. If they, for instance, a lot of the Ukrainian Air Force pilots are trained on Russian MiGs. And so some of the NATO countries do have Russian MiGs, and talking about how to make that available to them. But there's a lot of diplomatic issues. Again, the NATO countries don't want to be seen as directly supplying these, but getting them somehow there. I don't. It seems rather very unnecessarily convoluted to me, and doesn't really make a difference. Putin will know that it came from Poland, so does it matter that it was, that we shipped them directly to Ukraine, or we allowed the Ukrainian pilots to come to Poland to pick them up, or that we took apart part of the jets and shipped them to Ukraine, and then the Ukrainians put the jets back together again? Does Putin really care how they got the jets? He's going to know they got the jets.
Other questions, please?
Well, I think that China is feeling that they're in a tough predicament now, and certainly more sensitive. Russia is a key ally with China, although the relationship between the two countries has been somewhat distant over the last several decades, which is why China created and Nixon was able to go to China and form closer relations with China, because China was also trying to be distant from Russia, and we in the United States did not want China and Russia to be too cozy. And so it was to our own political advantage to start establishing relations and opening the door with China to take them out of the sphere of Russia. But over the years, they still have maintained very close relations, and so that's why China has always been reluctant in the UN to go against Russia. And so they might veto something if Russia, the UN Security Council, had a resolution that Russia was also opposed to. They might either abstain or they might vote with Russia. When sanctions were imposed against Russia over the invasion of Crimea several years ago, Russia started looking at China as a way to avoid sanctions. Use of independent financial system transactions, et cetera, et cetera. And so now Russia is saying, okay, if you're going to cut off your purchase of my Russian oil, well, I'm going to start selling it to China, and China needs as much as they can get for energy. And so, but now China is also saying, well, but the West might sanction some of my companies and my financial institutions for engaging in transactions with Russia. So they're beginning to, be a little bit wary of it. But they are ostensibly, and the Chinese people believe, that it's the fault of the United States that we have this crisis in Ukraine and the actions of NATO. It's going to be very hard for China to figure out how they can, all these countries come out with nice diplomatic language. Hey, we want to see an end to the violence, and we want respectful negotiation, and this should be solved diplomatically, and blah blah blah. But every country goes around saying stuff like that. And the question is, will they really intervene, put political pressure, or really urge Putin to step back? And are they willing to purchase a lot of the stuff from Russia and help Russia avoid the sanctions, for fear that China's institutions might also be subject to these sanctions as secondary sanctions? So it's a calculus that China is having to make. But the U.S.-China relationship is really at a very, very low point. I mean, we in America and the Western countries have very legitimate concerns about the trade and economic policies of China, and it's shared by the Western countries. President Trump was right to really go try to get tough against China, but the strategy was all wrong. I mean, it was unilateral tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States. And it's not paid for by the Chinese government. It's paid for by whoever picks up the stuff at the docks and at the airport. And so it's passed on to the consumer. All the stuff that you buy at Home Depot, I mean, Home Depot pays the tariff. Nordstrom pays the tariff. Dick's Sporting Goods pays the tariffs. And so much of what we use in our daily lives comes from China. The New York Fed and I think the Wall Street Journal have estimated that the impact of the tariffs on Chinese goods on the average American household is about $800 more per year. That's how much we're paying more. And we don't have that many substitutes. I mean, so, okay, unless you want to buy fancy, expensive Italian shoes or French shoes at Nordstrom, the shoes that you're going to be buying are primarily made in China. Virtually all the microwaves that people buy are made in China, and the list goes on. And the tools at Home Depot or whatever, made in China. China retaliated by imposing tariffs on American goods going into China. So, it means less purchase of American-made goods and services, which impacts jobs in America. But the funny thing is that China they're not stuck with American goods. They don't have to buy that more expensive American good anymore. They can buy those X-ray MRI machines from the Germans. They don't have to buy American soybeans. They can get it from Brazil. So they have more choices and ability to evade and not see an economic impact on the households of Chinese people compared to the households of Americans. Right objective, wrong strategy. If anything, it should have been all the countries or more countries of the West imposing tariffs against China. Because right now, that German good is cheaper when it's sold into China. And when American companies buy these Chinese products, whether it's these little nuts and bolts and components that go into the American-made product, and that component comes from China, it adds to the cost of the American product. So when that American product is then sold either in the United States in competition with the Chinese product, or in competition, with the European product, which has components from China, our stuff is at a competitive price disadvantage from that other product. The German stuff going into China is not subject to a tariff, so the German good is cheaper compared to the American good. So we're losing all the way around. While the Germans would love to see America win in this fight with China because they have similar complaints about the trade and economic policies of China. But they're sitting back and their companies are benefiting from it. Wrong strategy. It should have been many countries joining with the United States to get tough with China instead of us doing it by ourselves. And then, of course, we have human rights issues and concerns with China. The other thing is that China now is trying to be more world-class in so many other areas so that they don't have to be dependent on stuff from the United States. Just as we don't want to be dependent on minerals, pharmaceutical ingredients, medical supplies from China, or even everyday goods, we should be diversifying. And so American companies are setting up operations in Vietnam and Thailand and other parts of the world, and even bringing manufacturing back to the United States. China is doing the same thing. Because when President Trump a few years ago said, because China, one of the Chinese companies violated the terms of probation imposed by President Obama for transactions with North Korea and Iran, and the Chinese companies were not following through, President Trump said, okay, these companies will no longer be able to buy technology from the United States. And these were, for instance, two cell phone companies, and one was ZTE. They make inexpensive cell phones that they sell around the world. They were not going to be allowed to buy Corning glass for their cell phones. The Corning glass is in our cell phones, right? The Gorilla Glass. That would have bankrupted ZTE because Corning Glass was their only supplier of the glass on their cell phones that they produce, that they ship around the world. Now, President Trump later reversed that. But what was the message of the Chinese government officials? Our Chinese companies cannot be so reliant on high technology, sophisticated products from the United States. We therefore need to double down on our Made in China 2025, which is to be world-class in pharmaceuticals, electric automobiles, high technology, and the list goes on and on. So they are in some ways decoupling their economy and their reliance on U.S. goods, just as we are with China. But the human rights issues is almost the same thing as what we're facing with Russia, and the European countries are facing with Russia. To what extent are we going to say, we're not going to do business with China, even though we're so reliant on China for so many things, just as the Europeans are saying, well, do we really want to cut off and impose tough sanctions on Russia for Ukraine when we get so much of our oil and natural gas from Russia? Are we political leaders willing to have our citizens get so upset at the high cost of energy, and will they retaliate against us as political leaders, whether you're the French or the Germans or others?
We have time for one more.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, Ambassador Locke, thank you for your visit here. You have to know that the city of La Crosse, one of our 6 sister city relationships, is with a city in China. But you also have to know that with the great disruption caused by the virus, La Crosse's foreign student population up until 2 years ago was about 75% of all the foreign students. And so maybe a good question to end with is, what is the view from China of all of these young Chinese students coming to places like the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and will it resume?
I think it will resume. A lot of foreign students coming to the United States dropped precipitously during the Trump administration, when the president basically said that Chinese students were all spies and here to steal our intellectual property. And then, of course, when COVID hit, many students from around the world felt it was safer in their native countries than to come to the United States. And of course, all of our embassies were shut down around the world during COVID. So even if a person wanted to get a visa to come as a student, they couldn't. The embassies have all opened up, and I think we all know the value of international students. And so I think that that huge drop, and we saw that in our own college, that drop I think will reverse itself. And I think it's in America's political and economic self-interest to encourage foreign students to come to the United States. I remember shortly after September 11th attack, the United States really restricted the number of visas to foreign students coming into the United States. And then President of Harvard University, Larry Summers, wrote a letter to then Secretary of State Colin Powell, urging the State Department to open up and keep the lines of or access of foreign students to America. And basically his letter, and I saved that, it was in a Newsweek article that I've saved since 2012 or something like that. It said that the more international students come to America, the more they get to see our democracy in action with all of its pluses and minuses. And they will see how we benefit from that diversity of people and thought and culture, and how dynamic our society is, and how our democracy really is the bedrock of that innovation and the foundation of that innovation. And these are people that will be the future leaders of their own countries, and hope that when they go back to their native countries, that their experience in America will have whetted their appetite for faster progress and democratization of their countries. So I very much believe in that. And Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, said that diplomacy first starts with people-to-people contact and exchange. I mean, that's why we always say to American tourists in China, you're all ambassadors. You're all members of the Foreign Service, and how you conduct yourself, will cast a permanent imprint on people of remote villages and parts of China who really don't know that much about America. And so, you always hear those stories, long ago of the ugly American, the brash tourists in Europe or whatever, the pushy, demanding, rude American tourists in whatever part of the world, and how people's impressions of America are formed from those interactions. And so, and then of course, we know that so many foreign students who come here end up staying here. And they are the founders of Google, right? And so many of the high-tech companies and the innovations that we take for granted here in America were prompted by originally foreign students. I think former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, who served as CIA director under George H.W. Bush and Defense Secretary under George W. Bush, and was actually a president of Texas A&M for a while. He says that we should just staple a visa, a green card, on every foreign student who graduates from an American college or university. They've learned so much. Don't we want them creating the jobs and the discoveries and the innovations here in America, as opposed to kicking them back out, forcing them to go back to their native country, and then creating those technological changes and creating the companies there, hiring people there in competition with American companies here. So it would be in our own economic self-interest to take these, to enable these, the best and the brightest graduate students and foreign students to stay here in the United States and helping us constantly innovate and creating jobs in America. Yes, we need to be very careful about our national security. Clearly, we have to be very, very careful about our national security, but that doesn't mean that we exclude virtually every foreign student. And I'll just end by saying that diversity is the strength of America. Except for the Native Americans, we're all foreigners, whether we're first generation or 10th generation, whether our ancestors came on the Mayflower, a slave vessel from Africa, or a steamer from China. We're all foreigners, whether we're first generation or 10th generation. And it's been that constant wave after wave of foreigners and immigrants coming to our shores with their different perspectives, their cultures, their languages, their religions, their music, their architecture, their cuisine, that just has created this dynamic American society. And that innovation has been powered and fueled by that constant renewal of ideas by people from around the world. And so I believe that diversity is the strength of America. That is our strength, and we need to recognize it, we need to embrace it.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I wish we had more time,
Yep.
but Ambassador Locke needs to get to the airport
Yep.
to get home, and this will be, you can watch it again, and let's encourage our friends on the website. And thanks also to our wonderful friends from the Tommy G. Thompson
Yeah.
Center.
Governor Thompson was a great governor. He was a great, great governor.
Ambassador, what
Yeah,
a great
thank
day
you,
for
thank you,
UW La
thank you.
Crosse.
Right.
Thank you.
And Bill Catra, thank you very much. Bill Catra was one of my heroes when I was, we were both in Scouts together, and we were both working at a Boy Scout camp. And so, Bill Catra, my hero.
All right.